Well, where's the dictator when you need one? Hi, I'm Scott Ott with Stephen Green and Bill Whittle. And gentlemen, Rich Lowry has a piece in the New York Post under the headline, "Suddenly the left is complaining that Trump isn't dictatorial enough." The story practically writes itself, but you know that for a long time, the left has been saying that essentially the president is taking things into his own hands and is making decisions that really should be deferred to others, especially to Congress. But now, with the coronavirus pandemic, they want the president to start issuing edicts from the White House about the way people should behave and what states have to do. And he's been reluctant to do so. In fact, there was a big kerfuffle within the last couple of days because the president basically told governors of the states, hey, don't wait around for us to find respirators or masks or whatever. Go ahead and find your own sources for those. Stephen Green, what is it? Does the left does the left fear a dictator, or does the left desire a dictator?
Yes. And before I explain that, let me go off topic for just a second. I just wrote a short little half column for PJ Media earlier today. Russian President Vladimir Putin has done something kind of remarkable. He got the Russian parliament, the Duma, to pass a set of constitutional amendments last week, and the Russian Constitutional Court just approved them on Monday, and now it'll go to the voters on April 22nd, and I predict, I'm going out on a limb here, that voters will overwhelmingly say "da" to this slate of constitutional changes, because, well, that's just how it goes. It's getting more Soviet all the time. Anyway, what this constitutional change does is it nullifies his last 2 terms in office. I mean, it doesn't undo anything he did, but it just sort of makes them go away, because the Russian president is term limited to 2 6-year terms, and that's coming up in 2024. So by magically constitutionally doing a little bit of hand-wavium to make his last 2 terms disappear, he can run for re-election in 2024 for an office he's never held officially. Now, this is the kind of thing that actual authoritarian dictators do. They just bend reality, or at least make the appearance of bending reality with these legal shenanigans. Apparently, the Russian Constitutional Court decision on this is 52 pages of Soviet-esque legalese that nobody could ever unravel. And that's exactly the point, because they got to put some sort of gloss on this. And the communists, or in this case, the post-communists, are still very good at this kind of thing. So if you want to see what an actual dictator does, look no further than our friends in the Kremlin, who have just done something amazing. And it's not the first time either. I don't know if you remember this, but he was getting term limited out around 2008. So he switched places with his prime minister, Medvedev. Yeah. I think I just mispronounced his name. So Putin became prime minister for 4 years, even though the powers of the office of the president traveled with him to the prime minister's office. Just this is what they do. He's been in power since 1999. He'll be in power till he's dead. Anyway, as to what the left is doing, there are 2 things going on here. The first is they will criticize Trump for anything, even if it's the exact opposite of the thing they criticized him for yesterday or this morning or 5 minutes ago. It doesn't matter. It's any port in a storm. Anything will do, because Trump derangement syndrome makes people into idiots. Molly Jong-Fast, who's just one of the most vicious hot take artists of the left, was deriding Trump, I think it was yesterday or maybe earlier this morning, for not doing exactly what she'd accused him of being the dictator for yesterday. And people all over Twitter for about this. Federalism, how does it work? Because he's not telling the states what to do. Different states have different situation. He's making suggestions. He is working with Congress and the Fed to make money available and all the rest to try and move things along. But the states are still functioning like states in our federal system, at least as well as they ever have in the last century. And that's good to know. The other half is, yes, they actually do kind of want Trump to be a dictator. Remember what Rahm Emanuel said all those years ago, I think in 2009, about never letting a crisis go to waste. Well, it allows you, he said, to do things you couldn't do before. In other words, to subvert the Constitution, to subvert the rule of law, to just get things done, because that's what the left does. That said, it doesn't really matter in this particular crisis if the president is a Republican or not. If they can get the president to assume new powers, they know that Trump isn't going to be in office forever. Next January or January of 24, it might be a Democrat in power with all of these new powers that Trump assumes. So again, they don't actually, when Trump isn't a dictator, they will accuse him of being a dictator because it makes for nasty headlines. When he gets the chance to become a dictator, not actually, but when he gets a chance to become more authoritarian, they will actually cheer this on so that they can assume those powers and in a much more vicious fashion somewhere down the line.
Bill Whittle, perhaps it's because I'm a conservative. I have always been mystified by the complaints that I see in the media saying, well, why doesn't the federal government tell us what to do? Or why doesn't the federal government provide these things? The whole time that they've been talking about, the availability of medications or preventative tools, the whole time I've been thinking, well, gee, why just go out and get them? Why do you have to channel everything through Washington, D.C.? And now, when President Trump has declared an emergency, it seems to me that he's the furthest thing from a dictator. If you've watched any of his daily updates from the White House, he's continually deferring to other people. If he were Fidel Castro or Vladimir Putin, he'd be waxing eloquent endlessly from that podium and never give space. But he surrounded himself and continually refers to the experts and the great team that we have and how it's the best team ever and the best team in the world. And then he steps aside and Vice President Pence steps up and Dr. Fauci steps up. And then this other, he's got one person after another coming to the podium to field individual questions. What is it, Bill, about the progressive left that just, and forget Trump derangement syndrome, what is it about them where they kind of look to Washington, D.C. and say, what next, master?
David Horowitz said, if you scratch a liberal, you find a totalitarian. And underneath, and he's right, and this virus has put a real shock through the entire society, including these people. And despite the fact that they can't stand Trump, they want to be told what to do. And now you're really kind of down to the brass tacks difference between conservatives and liberals, is that we don't want to be told what to do, and they do. So you have to then ask yourself, well, why is that? Why is that? Because it seems to certainly be the case that liberals and Democrats want more government control over our lives, which means that somebody else makes the decisions for us. That's how it works. If you're an individualist and you want very little government, you have confidence in your own ability to deal with crises and make your own decisions. And to me, the only thing I can come up with is that the ability that the desire to run from your own personal responsibility and to have someone else tell you what to do is foundationally a childish instinct. It is the instinct of children. And it's the instinct of children because when things get rough, they run to mom or dad because they know that they are overwhelmed and they want kind of an expert opinion. It's like when I was taking my flying lessons, a couple times we were never in serious trouble, but there was a little bouncy there for a while, a couple moments. And when the flight instructor's in the plane, you want to turn to the flight instructor and say, well, what do we do now? What you really want is for him to fly you out of that mess. And the good flight instructors did what mine did, and they said, well, you're the pilot. What are you going to do? And then I fly myself out of the mess, and then I know I can fly myself out of messes, and therefore I'm not so worried about these kind of things anymore. So there's that whole kind of dependence on the state because they have no confidence in themselves, in their own ability to handle crises or whatever the case may be. This also bleeds over into the guns issue. But I think the thing that's most really remarkable about this, Scott, when it's all settled, and it will settle, the dust will settle on this, is that their effort to terrify people in order to get Trump. Because if you saw the debate between Biden and Bernie, you realize that if there was no Donald Trump and you just ran Biden versus Bernie, they would both lose. Either one of them would lose if they ran unopposed. They are absolutely appalling candidates. And the reason that the left has hyped this virus well beyond what is a necessary set of common sense and forward-looking regulations, the reason they've hyped it is that they look at this virus as a godsend. They look at it as this is our last best chance to have to get Donald Trump out of office, because they know they're not going to be able to do it in November electorally. So what they do is they scare the living daylights out of people enough to really hammer the economy. So they're hoping that there'll be a recession or something that they can pin on Trump. And on some level, whether they realize it or not, they want this epidemic to be bad, because the more people die, the more they're going to be able to blame Donald Trump for all of this. I don't think there's much question about that. You may not agree with it, but I think whether they're conscious of it or not, that is exactly what's happening. Here's what I think is going to be interesting about this. The press has, and you'll have to pardon the expression when it comes to the COVID-19 outbreak, but the press oversold the Russia angle, and then the press oversold the Ukraine angle, and then the press oversold the impeachment angle, and the press has certainly oversold the pandemic angle. And what I am convinced of, based on the medical evidence, is that while this is going to be a severe hit and we're going to take some losses from this, that this virus is not going to do anything like what they have panicked people into thinking it will do. Now, that doesn't mean that that's going to be able to change their opinion necessarily about politics, but what it does mean is that since the virus is going to do less damage than they are afraid it's going to do now, based on what their media has told them in an effort to get Donald Trump, when this thing turns out to be, again, with all consideration for the people who are going to suffer and who are going to lose through this, because we will, but they are going to end up being, they have in their minds, as a result of the media and the Democratic politicians, they have created such an apocalyptic scenario that I am convinced that reality will not live up to that expectation. And all that means is that since things won't be as bad as they have been told they would be, they certainly can't pin that on Trump. And some of them will say, well, geez, the Democrats and the press have been telling us that we're going to just bring out your dead carts. And that didn't happen. Maybe Trump did a good job with this. It's going to backfire just like everything else they try, because for the last 4 years, the Democratic Party has had no concrete strategy and no concrete positions for what they want to do to win in 2024. All they have done is make every effort possible to overturn the election of 2016. And when that failed, to make sure that this guy does not get reelected, and they will say anything, do anything, change whatever positions they need to change in order to make that happen. And I think this is a bridge too far for them. I think they have people utterly convinced now that this pandemic is going to be the Black Plague. And when it's not, because it won't be, then where will they be? I don't see where they can be anywhere other than Trump performed better than they told people he would.
There is an element in the executive branch of our sort of tripartite federal government that is monarchical. Even some of the framers and founders of this country would have said that's kind of the monarchy branch, and then the House of Representatives is the Democratic branch, and then the Senate is the Republican branch, and these three things counter each other, and essentially by dividing responsibilities and setting them against each other, we prevent something from just sweeping the country and from designing men from carrying out their nefarious designs on the rest of us. We've never really gotten over our desire for a king. I mean, you can go back into the Old Testament days, and the people would cry out to God for a king like the people around them had. They wanted to be like their neighbors. And there's this tendency in humans to want to slough off responsibility to somebody else so that you can have somebody else make the hard decisions and somebody else take the blame when it doesn't play out the way that you expected. But there is something about Americans that has also said, we can do it ourselves. How many people in this country do you really think were sitting around going, oh, there's a disease going around? Forget if you knew anything about the disease. There's a disease going around. I think I should try to avoid people who have the disease. I'm probably not going to shake hands with people as much if there's a lot of disease going around. I think I probably should stay out of sneezing range if it's an airborne disease. I think that the stuff that you're hearing from the federal government is just common sense stuff for avoiding getting infected with something. And so there's no great power or credibility that the president of the United States brings to that task. The president is responsible for overseeing the executive branch of the government. And if he has to do something, for example, like shutting down airline flights, for then dealing with the consequences of that, like, okay, do we now subsidize the airlines for all the money that they're going to lose because they're obeying the government dictate to shut down these flights? All of that is within the purview of the president of the United States. But we are not a people who looks to Washington and says, tell us what to do. We can't function without you. If you look at even the smallest communities in the United States, they have amazingly been able to self-organize to get things done. They've created sports leagues, and in some cases, actually years ago, created the schools that exist in those communities. I just read a book by David McCullough called The Pioneers, and it's talking about the settlement of Marietta, Ohio, and the people who went out almost knowing not where they were going, and outside of the envelope of protection of the federal government and of any other kind of government, frankly, and on the way lost a family member or two in the process of doing this, but continued on and had to cut down trees and make their own cabins and find their own food and do all this kind of stuff. In conjunction with their neighbors, they found a way to get it done. So we have been a people that do not rely on some distant person to tell us what to do. I think that Democrats feel that when the president doesn't stand up and tell people what to do, he's not doing his job. But sometimes doing nothing is doing something. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com and our friends at the Patriot Post for making this possible.